Sorry, y'all, give me 1 second while I get logged back in here. And hopefully, don't watch the password.
I'm not looking.
No, right, if I got the password, I forgot you, correct?
Yeah, just show.
Got it. All right.
I know, right?
All right, everybody, I'm gonna do this, hopefully not knock over anything, so if I do, apologize. All right. You guys still see the screen?
I think you knocked the cable out.
It's coming back. Just plug it back in. There we go, and whew, there we go. All right. So hello, everybody. For those of you that I have not met before, my name is Thomas Buttersworth. I am the Director of IT Security Operations and Deputy Chief Information Security Officer, Deputy CISO, here at Kennesaw State University. I've been here in this role for about 4 years. I was recently had a promotion into my current role for several months ago. And today I'm going to be talking about a riveting, amazing conversation about common vulnerability scoring system. Specifically 3.1, there is 4.0, and we'll go into some of those things here shortly. This is a less technical conversation and topic than you'll normally cover, so I'm going to preface with that. But I think it's extremely important that we cross the difference between the technical side, the business side, and how to bridge those gaps, right? So anytime you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. If you want to take a nap, that's fine too. We just may, mess with the computer or something in the meantime. But again, this is really meant to kind of articulate for those that have not had experience with CVSS or experience it or even have any knowledge of what it may be, right? All right, so who am I? Kind of went through it, my name and what my title is. I got my undergraduate degree from Southern Polytechnic State University. I actually have an undergraduate in accounting with a minor in business. I have a master's degree from Kennesaw State University, which is in business. And I think I had a focus in leadership as well, ethical leadership specifically. So how I got to where I'm at now is a crazy journey. I started studying at Southern Polytech as an electrical engineer and realized it was a great hobby for me, but not something I wanted to do for a career. And then slowly went into auditing, fraud, specialized in technology auditing, so IT auditing. So I have a Certified Information System Auditor certification, or a CISA. And then I also am a Certified Fraud Examiner from ACFE as well. So I've had experience in oil pipeline specifically, academics, healthcare, and telecommunications are my 4 primary areas that I've had experience in my career. So what are we going to be covering today? Really, I want you to understand really what CVSS is, the overview of it, and using it for decision making. It's something, again, that we're going to be prioritizing, especially as you go through making decisions and it impacts your organization. No matter how big or small, it can be quite valuable to have a base understanding of this. All right, so this specifically is a standardized method of rating vulnerability severity, right? It's going to be something that you can take and you can look at something you may not even have experience with and be able to interpret it to your business and how it impacts your organization, right, if it does. It was developed by FIRST, a form of incident response to security teams. A lot of time and effort goes into here, a lot of expertise, and I mean expertise around the world go into this. And it's a kind of a collaborative environment where we as experts go, or not me specifically, but other experts go in and help rate stuff for organizations. This is used by NIST and VD, which we'll talk about here shortly, Qualys, Tenable, and other platforms across the globe, because it impacts us. It allows us to take in how the severities of the vulnerabilities apply to our organizations. All right, so why should we care? The big part is you're taking your technical knowledge, and if you don't have technical knowledge, just taking and interpreting the vulnerabilities that applies to your organization and bringing it to your decision makers across your organization to apply it to be able to make informed decisions. They use CVSS scores to prioritize and allocate resources, depending on how big your organization is. Depends on how you're going to be able to prioritize things, right? If you're going to be stretching across the globe, you better have a very large or a very specific understanding of your environment. It's also common to vulnerabilities, just basic understanding of what's impacting your environment. Security operations centers use it to be able to prioritize things that are coming through, how they're detecting and apply to your organization. And security engineering roles apply this, especially in development and when they're doing product testing and identify vulnerabilities that may exist. All right, so this is where it gets kind of more of the details, and I apologize for the formatting. I really struggled with taking screenshots and kind of typing up how to apply this because, man, it's a lot of information, and I didn't want to bore you all to death and overwhelm you also with the information. But how CVSS structure really is broken down, right, is you have your base metrics, which are intrinsic vulnerability characteristics, right? You're going to have your temporal metrics, which are your factors that evolve over time. Environmental metrics that adjust the organization's specific context, right? So just because you have a rating, and at the bottom down here is from 0 to really no existing impact whatsoever, to 10, which is if you have a 10 in your environment, then you really need to investigate, determine if you have any compensating controls you can put in place, or if there's anything that you can do to mitigate those, because those usually are really impactful to organizations. However, that's where your environmental metrics come in. Just because you have a CVSS score of 10 does not mean it applies to your organization as a 10. And we'll get into that more here in just a few minutes. All right, so if you go to, don't quote me on this, it's nvd.nist.gov, I believe is the specific website. This is what they call the CVSS calculator. So if you Google CVSS calculator, this, I think, first is also going to be a website that pops up that also has a calculator very similar to this. And this is kind of what they use to determine your rating, all right, or the vulnerability rating. And they go in and go through the attack vector and everything else, and I'll go through a different slide where you can read it a little bit better than this because my eyes, I can't read that very well. The contrast is terrible. But it's something that I wanted y'all to see to understand all the varied impacts when it goes into making a calculation like this, right? All right, so before we get into that, here's an example of the different varying ratings, all right? So again, you have critical, you have high, you have medium, you have low, right? Sometimes you have a category informational in there depending on your vendor, depending on what's out there. But it's important to note that the varying ratings are different for the different the codes here. When you see CVE, it's a common vulnerability and exposure, I think is what the E stands for. I get exploit, but I think it's exposure. And you see the next 4 numbers is 2025, right? I took this sample in 2025 before the gas leak happened. We did do the presentation that day, but it's something that is coded for that specific year. This means that this vulnerability came out this year. It doesn't mean that it was exploited this year, right? Just because there's a vulnerability does not mean that it is actively exploited in the wild. There are things we'll go into in a few minutes, but just know that coding. If you see something from 2020, that's an older vulnerability. It came out in 2020, 2018, 2026. Those are all the new ones you see. So everything that has come out from date, or I guess from January 1 to date, will have a 2026 preceding all of this. And the code after that, if I'm not mistaken, is just when it came out and the impact associated with that, right? So we have the rating there. It's based off that calculator I showed you earlier. And if you ever want to see the wonderful list of vulnerabilities, again, that nvd.nist.gov, there's a whole section that lists out all the vulnerabilities that are being listed out there, right? And they're happening every day. Homeland Security, CISA actually has a cyber hygiene program that you can actually subscribe to for free, and it will provide you with summary updates on there. What they know is KEVs, or known exploitable vulnerabilities, right? Those are ones that if you address any vulnerabilities out there, the KEVs are probably the ones you want to focus on, not solely, but specifically announced there. It impacts a lot of organizations, and usually when they announce it, they're either seeing exploitation in the wild or they're seeing trends of potential exploitation. All right, so base metrics, we talked about those. I'm not going to go into that in more detail, but we're going to go in detail here, all right? So this is part of the exploitability metric, the calculator that I mentioned there. If you actually go into that, and I'll show you here shortly, go into that calculator, whenever you make a change to this, it'll show the transition, right? So if you go in, you say, hey, the attack vector is local, So probably gonna lessen the severity if it was network access, right? So network means somebody just can touch your network and gain access to the system potentially, or try the exploitation through that app. Attack complexity, low, high. That's a little biased, a little bit subjective, I guess you could say, depending on what we're looking at. Could be low, as simple as throwing an SQL injection into a URL potentially, right? Maybe there's a validation error in the database and it could cause some issues. However, high would be an example of if you have somebody that has that intimate knowledge of the system from an operation level, maybe even application level, and maybe even know the timing variances within configuration, right? So maybe it's significantly more difficult, and that can also decrease and increase your ratings, right? Privilege required. None, well, that's a terrible thing, right? If I can throw an exploit to a system and not have any needed privilege, that's gonna be a problem. Low, to give you an example, right, is that maybe you have an application, 16 general users. Low, it may not be a huge issue because your population is so small, right? You still have to be authenticated as a general user or whatever the level is that it identifies. And maybe there's a privilege escalation, right? So low level, still not great, right? It can be problematic. And it is high. You need an elevated privileges, usually beyond the base user, right? But going back to this example, let's just say you have low privilege needs. You have a larger set, right? Let's think about Kennesaw State University. Let's just say we have 100,000 users in this environment. Well, low privilege may be a lot different for 100,000 users versus the 13 or 20 smaller company, right? So just be mindful of your kind of blast radius of these applications or systems that you need access to, or try and gain access to. User interaction, that's a big one, right? So none, that's a bigger problem as well. Sometimes user interactions are required. To give you an example, there was an exploit not that long ago, I believe it was within Outlook, that if you even received a calendar invitation, that was enough if you had the desktop client that it actually ran the exploit, right? It was a problem. It was a major thing that Microsoft took action on pretty quickly. However, there's other exploits similar to that, except for it requires a user to interact with the message, right? Interact with the email, interact with the link in the email. So that's kind of the difference in variance, if that makes any sense, right? Scopes, they can change, right? Our scopes can change as new evidence comes out. We're able to potentially identify that, hey, maybe they found an additional piece within the exploitation that made it even higher or more severe. Right? Does that kind of make sense to everybody? High level. All right, so now we get into the impact metric. If you haven't, has anybody heard of CIA? Awesome. If you haven't, you likely will in your information security, cybersecurity, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are the three that you're going to hear. Those are big and important for us to take into consideration. Similarly, these calculators, you want to understand is, does our confidentiality get impacted? Integrity, availability, how does it? To give you an example, our denial of service attacks, right? That's going to impact our availability. For a minor system that may be irrelevant to us, to where we can address the vulnerability later on. But if it's a high one, if it's like our domain controllers, if it's something that is critical to our infrastructure, availability is absolutely necessary, right? So we want to adjust and pivot to that, and these calculations go into it. Integrity, similar. If you have weather data that's publicly accessible, that is used for some sort of research, you may want to have accuracy, right? You may want to have extreme accuracy, but maybe not as much as a banking system, right? If you have integrity issues on a banking system, that could impact a significant amount of people across the world. So understanding how we want to do that. Also, for anybody, I'm not saying that weather data is not important, because it absolutely is. I'm just giving the variance of impact, right? Similar to confidentiality, we want to protect confidentiality, but high impact confidentiality, somebody can gain access to everything. I'll use the weather example again. A lot of environmental data is uploaded to the public anyways. It's not a big deal. However, banking information, student data, that stuff, we definitely do not want to get out there at all. So we protect that, additionally. All right. So temporal metrics here. So this is some of the things I want a disclaimer almost here, right? Is I want you, anything that I talk about today, go out and explore yourself, okay? Verify yourself, experience what is out here, because your experience may be slightly different. What works for you may be slightly different. Your perspective is going to be potentially different, right? So I encourage you, especially with the maturity rating, and what I mean a lot by that is when you have unproven, proof of concept, functional, and high, all right? Those are extremely big differences, especially if you have an exploit that came out. Maybe you have a level 8 severity, which is pretty bad, right? But it's unproven. It's just theoretical. Somebody can say, hey, I think we can do it, versus they have a proof of concept. Well, proof of concept, well, how complex is that, right? You need to look into the details at times. Sometimes proof of concepts are in very strict lab environments that somebody had very unique situations and scenarios on. So understanding the nuances of that is absolutely imperative and requires experience, right? At times, you will see on forums announcements of exploitations of vulnerabilities that may not have been updated on this site. So understanding where your confidence comes in on the sources that are reported, that's absolutely critical. Functional, we have a working exploitation. High, pretty much the general public has access to it, and we're going to have larger problems as things go out. Right? That's where the complexities come in. That's where the interpretations come in. And then we have remediation level. A lot of times when people disclose these vulnerabilities, they'll work with the vendors, like the white hats, the gray hats, people that are disclosing correctly, and they'll go to the vendor and say, hey, we've identified a vulnerability in your application. Can y'all patch it before we go live with our announcement that we had a vulnerability, right? Always, always, always go through the proper channels for disclosures, okay? There are actually organizations out there that are designed for that type of guidance and direction. So sometimes there's official fixes or temporary fixes that are applied before even the greater public identifies that there was a vulnerability, right? Sometimes there's workarounds, and sometimes there's nothing available. Sometimes you as the organization have to interpret how to best protect these environments by the exploitations that are out there, or by the vulnerabilities, excuse me. And then we have report confidence. How reasonable or have we confirmed, right? It's something that can be challenging, especially in these proof of concepts or unproven states, right? Is that they're not going to be confirmed outside of, if they're working with a third party or working with somebody that's disclosed to validate that something was done. So they'll all go through that. And I summarized all of that as much as I possibly could. There's so much nuances. I highly recommend, again, going out and verifying that. Anybody have any questions at this point, or just comments or thoughts? I'm really running through this stuff here. I'm a big sip of water. All right, so now we're talking about environmental metrics, okay? And these, again, are a little bit subjective. You need to know your organization's footprint. You need to know where your weaknesses are. You need to know where your strengths are. You need to know, do you have a web application firewall? Do you have a firewall that's on your border? Do you have a data center firewall? What levels of protections do you have in place? That takes time, right? Your users, you know what your weaknesses and strengths are, users. Do you have users that fall for phishing scams routinely? Do you have people that are your customers falling? Do you have your vendors that also have these type of situations and vulnerabilities? So we take all of this and can adjust it, and I'll show a little bit more of an example. But looking at the modified base metrics is important because we need to, again, take that information, mold it to ours, and a lot of times, and I'm going to this, is that we have solutions that will do that for us instead of us having to manually do that, right? So outside of some incorrect diagram designs here, man, it's really difficult to find a good example of a network diagram online, just to let you know, right? And God help anybody that asks AI to design network is all I can say. So this is kind of a general example, right, of understanding your ecosystem. Is kind of I went into just a few minutes ago, right? General VPN requirement, potentially for the general user coming in from the internet that are not on-prem, right? Is we have a lot of work remote options. Sometimes our environmental or enterprise protections don't go across borders. And so what I mean by that is to say you take your laptop or your desktop home, work remote. Well, sometimes you may have an endpoint or an EDR on your device, but your network protection doesn't exist anymore potentially, right? Unless your device is configured in specific ways. So sometimes it's a gap or an oversight that organizations have. So with our border firewall, we have web application firewall, data center firewall. What I mean by that is a lot of times our data centers have stricter requirements than our general borders do, okay? And that's just allowed for better interactivity, and that's an example here even at Kennesaw State University, right? So we have multi-tier different data firewall levels, and then we have different levels of permission sets, right? Different types of VPNs for different types of access, right? Sometimes we have vendor access through VPNs for their systems and their environments. So how does that play into your ecosystem that you work in? So here's an example, real quick. If you go to that calculator, sometimes even in the vendors like Tenable and Qualys, they'll give you this wonderful little AVN, right? ACL, right? So that stands for Attack Vector Network. Man, what's the other ACL?
Attack complexity?
Complexity, thank you, low. Privilege required, none. User interaction, none, right? Scope change, unchanged is what it stands for. Confidentiality impact, high. Integrity, high. Availability, low, right? So what I mean, you have to practice and experience some of this. That's where some of the technical stuff comes in, where you may get somebody that sends you this, and you're like, I don't know what that means, right? So the calculator helps out. So if you got to go through, don't forget that you have those tool sets. And this is also the modified attack vector and everything associated with the environment there, right? So sometimes you can change it to where you have a 9.1 that's high, and then it goes back down to 7.1 because the system isn't at your network level. You have to be on prem to access that particular system, right? So taking that and modifying it, it's important. All right, so this is where things can change up, right, with decision making. They use the scores for prioritization. We use it for conversations because it's usually not one vulnerability, right? It's not two vulnerabilities in your environment. Kennesaw State University, we have tens of thousands of vulnerabilities in our environment at varying rates, right? Every one of these devices have some vulnerability that we monitor and update and patch when we can, right? But we also don't want to impact the ability for y'all as students to be able to, we don't want to impact your education experience, right? Negatively, that is. We also want to take immediate action on certain things. 5.3 is an example. Maybe we just want to patch it, routine patch scheduling, right? Then we have 2.0. Maybe we just monitor that for now. Right? Maybe it's not big enough for us to worry about, not big enough to impact. But again, adjusting all of these associated with your organization. All right, so this is super small, but this is an example of a dashboard in Tenable SC. This is not Kennesaw State University, just for the record, but ours looks very similar. I want to highlight that. It's something for us that we have thousands and thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities. We try to address them as we possibly can, associated with working and collaborating with the different groups across campus. UITS, we partner heavily with each other internally to work with the business owners to address these type of things. So when your organization says, hey, we have over 6,000 critical vulnerabilities, right? It's like, all right, well, how do you begin to unpack that, right? How do we understand the information? But every one of these is made up of some sort of CVSS-based scoring that's adjusted. Tenable does this. Tenable uses, we'll get into in a second, is what they call the VPR, the variable rating. I can't remember what the P stands for, but priority rating, I think is what it stands for. And they take the CVS applied to your environment based on your configurations and ecosystem and go from there and do that. And it's extremely helpful because you may not have as large of an impact. And some criticals may go to high and some highs may go to low. Anybody have any questions on this chart or anything? And I highly recommend creating dashboards associated with the information that's important to you, important to your leadership, depending on what your activities are. Because one thing that's challenging is what your leadership wants to do and information they care about is important, but maybe not to the person that is actually trying to address the vulnerabilities on a specific server or system, right? This is a lot of noise for somebody that's associated with one system, one environment versus the enterprise that may care about the overall, right? This conversation can help you get into some resource conversations with executive leadership of needing additional support across the organization, right? Yeah, David.
So you mentioned, creating dashboards to cater to your needs of it, what you have deemed most important. But how would you go about like deeming what is most important to your organization? I know that's a pretty like broad question for what it means,
Yeah.
but could you just like, just break down like 2 or 3 examples of like the why we focus on this thing over that thing in a example environment if you have one?
Mainly it's revenue driving, right? As a lot of organizations want to understand where their money comes from, right? If you can't accept money from organizations, maybe you want to focus on that, right? If you want your customers to be able to pay you, or maybe you pay your vendors and everything, right? Where's your data, right? I mean, for us, a lot of our critical systems are D2L, Banner, right? But at other times, it's like, well, if you can't get to D2L and Banner from a networking point, right? Well, then it doesn't matter if D2L and Banner are up. Well, if you can't get into a network, can't get into authentication, those are also key systems you would want to prioritize. And a lot of times when you have larger organizations, you have buckets of individuals that find things more important, right? You may have an application team that supports one piece that another application team doesn't, right? They support a different application and they care about their stuff. So the more noise, and this is my personal experience, is that when you have a larger bucket of stuff kind of thrown in together, they don't care, right? They're gonna look at the noise and be like, I don't know where my stuff is, and it's hard for me to filter this data. And so filtering that and collaborating with your business or your system owners to find out, hey, what data do you care about, right? Why do they care about vulnerability management? Why do they care about the vulnerability on their system? Because it's been up and running for 2 or 3 years, no issues whatsoever. Sure, it's got a vulnerability that's been exploitable in the wild and it's a publicly facing system, and it's just inevitable that one day somebody's gonna touch on it, right? It's not a matter of somebody, like, if it will be exploited, it's when it will be exploited, and can you detect if it is exploited. Again, compensating controls, they all make a difference, right? Maybe you have geographic barriers put in place for certain things. You may have a limited scope where Russia can't hammer your systems, but all they need is a VPN into the States, right? And there's how many VPN services out there that are free now, right? By the time they get taken down, they could be a case. I'm not picking on Russia, by the way, that's just one example, right? But it's a good question. Did that help answer the question there? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and having conversations with the business is absolutely imperative, right? So technology-wise, we know what our important systems can be, right? Network connectivity. So your firewalls, your switches, routers, you have your domain controllers that you want to be able to have access. You want to have your DNS, if you do have those up and running correctly, right, and protected. Nobody knows how to route the traffic. Doesn't matter. It's going to be very difficult. You can always tell people, hey, just use the IP address, but if you have 20,000 IPs, then it's going to be difficult to do that. All right, so talk about the limitations, kind of hit on this, right? It doesn't consider exploit trends or asset criticality. It doesn't take into interpretations may vary, right? And best used within broader risk frameworks. And what I mean by that is there are other combinations that we want to consider when we're talking about the CVSS. So beyond the CVSS, I'm not going to read this verbatim, right? But it goes back to Tenable, the vulnerability priority rating, right on the vulnerability priority piece there. And then Rapid7, they have their real score. Qualys has their threat protection score. And there's several open source vulnerability management platforms that also take that into consideration. So when you go in and you're prioritizing, like, hey, this is my critical systems, these are my assets that we can't live without, or hey, these are my network environments that are absolutely critical for access, they take that into consideration. They can adjust where you now can take the CVSS and modify it based off of your systems. Again, one example is publicly accessible systems. If somebody can access anything or just touch the environment, then that's a problem. Versus something that may have or may require your advanced VPN access, not just general VPN, but maybe you have an elevated VPN somewhere else to be able to access, or maybe you have something behind jump boxes. Industrial control system environments or telecommunications environments are usually heavily segmented for those exact reasons. They're also some of the most exploitable environments because of just how special and unique they are, right? So understanding, again, going back to your environment, knowing, do you have an industrial control system environment? The fire alarm that just went off earlier, for those that were here for that, right? Did somebody, can you exploit that, cause kind of chaos, a diversion, instead of something else that may be going on? So kind of using that as an example. All right, so I'm gonna go into a little bit of personal experience here. Anybody remember the exploits from 2021 Log4j? Anybody? Anybody else impacted by that? Because I definitely were, right? So for those of you that don't know, in 2021, towards the end of 2021, I think these were November, like if you look at the end numbers there, they're pretty long, right? So 45,000, the vulnerability scoring there. I think it was November, maybe is when the exploits came out, late November, and then December, January, and all of a sudden, you know, we realized here at Kennesaw State University, like, holy God, we have 1,300 instances of these potential exploitable vulnerabilities, and the method of detection at this point in time was literally running a find to see if you had a Log4j in your environment, the specific versions. Feel free to look those up. I won't go into the details, but I think it was a 2.0. Anyway, you can look it up. But that's a lot, right? So how do we even prioritize, and how do we look at this? And I can tell you, I learned some of this within my environment and the lessons that we had to, because trying to prioritize and package 1,300 different instances, working with the vendors especially, right? Like, hey, we have this file that we identified. We need to determine, are y'all exploitable to this, because we can't run it without potentially taking down the environment, right? And so sometimes it's not just about you, but it's about working with your vendor to understand, are we really exploitable to this stuff, right? It's not always just a quick conversation. And sometimes your vendors are like, hey, thanks for letting us know. We'll look into that, right? Sometimes, and hopefully, the vendors are great and they're on top of their stuff, but my experience is that's very few. So just be mindful of that. So how do we prioritize? Well, we prioritize it based off of what we believe to be the publicly facing environments first, right? Hey, we think these are exploitable. We know they're publicly facing. We were actually negatively impacted by a pass-through, I believe it was, to another system that we hadn't taken into consideration as being publicly facing. But the interaction went from one system to another system that was also exploitable, and that caused a lot of problems for us, right? Thankfully, we identified it very quickly by our detections, and our infrastructure team was awesome about taking that down. We did a forensic investigation in collaboration with them to find out really how broad were we impacted. Thankfully, with the package that was called down, this is a remote code execution vulnerability, and man, this impacted the entire world. So how do we communicate? Well, we did. It was a challenge, but it was also building up those relationships key with that, with the teams. Understanding like, hey, I've never worked with you before, and you don't know who I am, but we have this major vulnerability that we have to have patched. It took us months to remediate this overall, right? And we had to have follow-ups and follow-ups and follow-ups. And I mean, probably close to 4 to 6 months at a minimum is what it took for us. And we, getting back to prioritization, public facing, impact of the organization, what could happen, is there any lateral movement considerations, and go from there, right? And this was, again, a discovery phase for us almost, right? We knew stuff was happening, or could happen, but it really brought up a lot of this. Lessons learned, have your relationships built up with your organization. I can't stress that enough. Your vendors, knowing your environment, it's all these type of things that are just really difficult to do in the moment when you're trying to do an incident response. But being able to communicate with your leadership on, hey, we address these because of the impact. We address these because we believe that they can be pass-throughs or lateral movement, and we address these. But we used these vulnerabilities in their exploit, their CVSS ratings. I believe they were 9, maybe 10s. I have to double check that. Y'all can go verify again, verify everything. And yeah, I hope to not see that one again, because that was pretty bad. Any questions? All right, so key takeaways here, y'all. Is that really it consists around risk communications, okay? Y'all are gonna have conversations. You're gonna have conversations with business-oriented people. Maybe many of you are business-oriented people here. You would take what you know, translate it into the technical conversations like, hey, I see that we have a 10 over here. Can you tell me why we're not impacted by this, or what compensating control do we have in place, right? Why are we not prioritizing this? Sometimes things get missed, okay? It's a big ecosystem out here. It's a big world, all right? Sometimes just asking the right question. Technical side, you can go to the business and say, hey, we need to prioritize resources. If we don't, prioritize this and make this a priority. I know there's other projects important for us, but this will cripple our infrastructure if we don't address it right now, right? And then also, again, the technical and business perspectives. Sometimes I get emails from people across the organization and say, hey, you were notified about this. Are we impacted? Are we notified about this by our vendor? Or hey, you identified something with our vendor, we need to have that conversation. Critical skills, cybersecurity professionals, right? I think it is absolutely imperative, not for y'all just to know the technical aspects. It's very important to be clear, right? There are going to be things that you identify that are vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, design issues, and everything else, right? But for you, your organization, using this skill to communicate what impact those type of findings are, not so much on the misconfiguration side, but the vulnerability and exploit side, right? I know it's helped me out, it's helped my teams out. David's had some exposure to it with our team, maybe not as much yet, but definitely in the Microsoft ecosystem we're moving to. So yeah, there's that. And I think some of the resources I mentioned earlier, the nbd.nist.gov, first.org, and first.org, and then there's a calculator for 3.1. 4.0, again, is not as streamlined by any means. It is definitely a valuable calculator. It's more complex in this. 3.1, I'd recommend that because that's what most of the solutions are still using today. Some solutions I've seen go from 3.1 and have a 4.0 in there, but most are still using 3.1. So, yeah, there's that. And I think that's it. Any questions? Yes.
So I'm not 100% sure if you've already talked about this, but for supply chain attacks, like for example, I know there were some on, there's one recently on MongoDB, right?
What?
And when there's certain cases where, I don't know if it applies to MongoDB, but I know there's like a bunch of supply chain attacks.
Sure, yeah.
And you can't really do anything but kind of sit there and go, can you fix this faster? What do you do? Do you kind of turn that system off? Do you redirect traffic? Do you try and create your own patch? Like, what do you guys do about that?
Great question. We're experiencing this now on conversations, right? So the answer, like, what do you do? It depends on the system, right, and how critical it is to your organization. Can you be down with it for 2, 3 weeks, days, hours, right? In most cases, right, it's usually vendor related, right? It's like, hey, if we update MongoDB, do we break the vendor supported and void any contracts, right? Any warranty support that we have with them. In this case, it's really partnering with the vendors and pushing the vendors on saying, hey, you got a problem, right? Can you tell me what compensating control you have, or did you push an update, right? Because sometimes vendors will push updates, not tell anybody, and even though the vulnerability still shows, maybe your detection mechanism hasn't validated that, oh, there is a compensating control. Because that's also something that happens, is that sometimes you have vulnerability management solutions like Tenable that will identify it based off of the specific version of software that's installed or application that's installed. So in doing that, you have to consider, like, you have to partner with that vendor, like, hey, did you do it, right? A lot of times vendors will post out there on their updates saying, hey, we've addressed this vulnerability. The other thing is sometimes contractually, you can say, hey, like, we really need you to provide the support that you said you're going to provide, right? Sometimes a vendor comes back and says, hey, if we make this update, we don't know what the consequences are, but our engineers are working on it, right? Can you put a compensating control in place? Can you limit the scope? Because what we've done many times is we've had a vendor that'll have like an Oracle vulnerability, right, in their environment. We can't patch it because if we patch it, we break the system potentially. Sometimes you can have some test systems, right? But then how confident are you that you're not really impacting the system, even from like an integrity point, if you do update it? And then that's kind of a long-winded response, but that's kind of the process that we go through, right? At the same time, we were able to, like, going back to that Oracle example, well, only 10 people use it, right? This one system. So we went to the 10 users who were like, hey, we know you normally just access this from the network, but we want to put it behind the VPN requirement, right? Can we put it behind the VPN? Are y'all okay with that? All of them were like, hey, we use a VPN anyways. Cool, awesome, right? Limits that blast radius potential, right? sometimes your organization has to accept that risk. Like, hey, we know this is an exploit. We have no compensating control we can put in place. The vendor's working on it. So do we keep the system up? And that's goes back to how critical is this system for your organization. Yeah. So I hope that helps answer.
So like control the area of its effect, right? And then throw any Band-Aids you can while telling them to go fix it. Kind of.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, right, the best case scenario is you could apply something. The vendor sometimes will say, hey, run this and it'll fix this, right? Sometimes it's even just as simple as a registry key change, right? Sometimes it's as complex as having to rebuild some core piece of that application, which if you have the staff for it, it's awesome. But I don't know of many organizations that have that bandwidth to dedicate to something like that, right? But yeah, Band-Aids are great, but compensating controls, if you have a web application firewall, you can throw in some SQL injection stuff came up not that long ago. We just put an application in front of the WAF, threw the SQL injection protection on top of it, and just monitored. Monitoring's a big one too, because sometimes you can put in some automation where if you see unusual traffic, you can sever it, like you can, block it or quarantine that environment, isolate it, pretty quickly. But most organizations probably don't have that type of capability established, especially smaller ones. But it is something that you can build out if you have some kind of mature environments there. Yeah.
Yeah, I know a lot of people in this, or a lot of students in this room are pretty much or very new to the space of cybersecurity. So how would you suggest them going about like getting more hands-on experience at like CVSSs or like, talking to vendors or that kind of stuff? Because, if you've been in internships, then you do have that experience. But if you're starting out like freshman or sophomore year, how do you go about that? How do you bridge that gap?
Oh, thanks. Good question. Appreciate the question on that. So to get the experience, right, I can't stress like these organizations like ISSA, the student organizations, the opportunities that are offered to you when you're in school, take advantage of everyone you can, right? Even some of I know David had mentioned the CompTIA Plus, Security Plus certs and different things. Organizations a lot of times have student discounted rates for that stuff. Get involved with them. Because really a lot of the people that are recruiting, a lot of the people that are really knowledge sharers are parts of these organizations and willing to impart that information to you. If you can shadow anybody, I know definitely hands-on experience is a big one. I highly recommend you kind of see and experience what that kind of looks like from a day-to-day. Connect with professionals, right? Like message me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with y'all on LinkedIn. Just share some of my insights, and I appreciate y'all letting me come and talk about the non-technical topics over here that is presented on. But really, is being a part of the different services that Kennesaw offers. Handshake is another one that can connect you with different groups that are hiring. Partner with people that have been a part of this group before as well, because they have connections sometimes to the apprenticeships or internships that may not be as well as publicly advertised. I know a lot of those are really competitive these days. So yeah, I wish I had hey, this is what to do, but that's not so much. Certifications, that's a big one too. Get your certifications. Degrees are amazing, right? I have two myself, so I highly recommend it. But certifications are a big one that people are looking for these days as well.
Yeah, would you recommend like any specific projects that students could follow related to CVSS scores, like vulnerability scanning?
Yeah, so one of the things that I found valuable was Burp Suite was one. We have an enterprise license here in Kennesaw that we're beginning to harness more and more. The personal version is great if you can partner with your organization, or if you have a system at home that you can scan. It's amazing what comes back. I highly recommend testing in very controlled environments or environments you have permission to test in, just as a disclaimer. So Burp Suite, getting understanding Kali distributions on Linux is another one. It's not as much, but it gets you hands-on, kind of curious on that. Let's see. Burp Suite's a really good one. I can't remember any of the open source vulnerability management tools, but I'll take a look and see if I can think of it.
That's good.
Awesome. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
So, I'm kind of like asking like your approach on this, but how have you approached the issue of like competing teams with competing priorities and the issue of, security being a cost center? And I guess how have you actually like effectively assigned like ownership of vulnerabilities and gotten teams to actually like move on patching and, fixing things, keeping things up to date? Especially like maybe development teams that are developing in-house applications and things like that.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the team. So we preface with that, right? You have some teams that
It's
are
always
just,
a relationship.
yeah, there's some teams that are like, hey, you sent me a notice, your security or your cyber, your whatever team you are, we're gonna address it as soon as we can, right? They prioritize. Some, they build security into their development, right? Their configuration, they're proactive in that, right? So it's not as much as like we're reaching out, we're just validating certain things. I know it's simple to say, oh, relationship building, right? But there are a lot of challenges at times because other teams are like, yeah, I'll get to it when I get to it. It doesn't impact me right now. And honestly, when it goes down, they're not the ones doing the investigations a lot of times. Sometimes they're providing the logs, but a lot of times it's like, oh, just let me know when I can turn my system back on or what we need to do. In those cases, it's really important for you to get your leadership to buy in to where they also have their relationships built up so they can articulate the importance of that, right? That also can be a challenge depending on the organization you work for, but building up the relationship proactively, having those difficult conversations respectfully, right? Is like, hey, listen, this is the vulnerability, this is the impact of the organization, this is the likelihood, right? And sometimes demoing it if you can, right? Using Burp Suite or using some sort of other, solution out there can also bring it, to light and show like, oh, this is quite simple to do, right? We've done one not that long ago that we were able to scrub information, right? Simple, quite not difficult at all, but it stems that conversation of doing so. But again, articulating that if you do throw an exploit to take down a system, sometimes it's not great, right? You want to do it in a controlled environment or at least with the permission to do so. I know that it's probably answer, kind of your.
I always start to hear different thoughts on it.
Yeah, and it's not, working with vendors is a difficult one too, right? It's like, what ownership do we have, especially smaller companies, right? Is that sometimes you use local businesses that are within the city or the area that your company is in. And a lot of times they're like, hey, you spend $10,000 or $15,000 with us, right? We're not going to address that for you, right? Like, it's going to cost us more money than we invest into it to address it. Those are real conversations, right? I had many of those when I worked at a medical organization or healthcare system, excuse me. And it was companies like, hey, listen, you're spending $15,000 with us. We're not going to overhaul this, right? And I've also worked with organizations that are like, hey, we know you do it this way. How much, because it's so important to us, would it cost us to pay for y'all to fix the issue? And that's a whole different conversation. Most companies do not do that, but those are things to think about, right? If it's worth your time as an organization, maybe you do go into that conversation. But I highly recommend just, again, holding your vendors accountable. Sometimes you've got to really press the salespeople on that one. It's like, hey, if you don't fix this issue, we're not going to renew. We can't renew, right? Sometimes it's a compliance issue, right? Regulatory compliance. Like, hey, we will be breaking the law or not following certain standards if we don't address these things. Cool. Yeah.
So I know you mentioned that there are basically cybersecurity apprenticeships at KSU and probably part of the interview process, but I was wondering, like, what are you specifically looking for in students that are applying, like qualities or skills that they have that are outside of basically what's taught in school in the program? So
yeah, it's a really good question, right? So what I specifically look for, right, in my apprenticeships that we have on my team, this is for me, not for everybody else, but for me and our team, right, is I look for curiosity, right? I look for, do you just settle for the answer, or do you want to understand kind of like the root cause of what causes? Like, how far do you go in your analysis? I don't expect you to solve the problem, right? I don't expect you to have that knowledge. I mean, the extreme technical side, I don't expect apprentices to have, right? It's the whole point of apprenticeships. but the curiosity piece is big for me. I want to know, like, hey, are you going above and beyond, kind of the average individual? Do you just want to, look at this and be done with it and close it out real quick? Or do you actually, do that? If you create your own sites or, have your own GitHub, that's great. Those are wonderful. But at the end of the day, do you maintain it? Because we go out validating, right? If you put those on your resume, and you'd be surprised at how many people don't do that. But at the same time, I don't necessarily hold that against you as students, but it's those type of attention to details, especially in cybersecurity, your incident responses. The slightest miss can sometimes be a big problem. But the apprenticeships, those. I focus on curiosity. I focus on drive.
Thank you.
Awesome. Anybody else? If not, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you're students, you can email me, message me on Teams. But yeah, thank you all very much. I definitely appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity, everybody. Simon?